The morning sun cast long shadows across the NATO training facility in Virginia Beach as Captain Sarah Chin adjusted her tactical gear for what would become the most pivotal day of her military career. At 28, she had already broken through more glass ceilings than most officers saw in a lifetime. But walking onto the elite SEAL training range still felt like stepping into hostile territory. The other trainees barely glanced her way as she checked her equipment, their conversations flowing in the easy camaraderie of men who had never questioned their place in these sacred halls of military excellence. Sarah had learned long ago that being the only woman in the room meant carrying the weight of every female service member's reputation on her shoulders. "Look what the brass dragged in," muttered Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a stocky man with arms like tree trunks and an attitude to match. His comment carried just far enough to reach Sarah's ears, but not so far that any instructor might overhear. "Guess they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel now." Sarah continued her equipment check, her fingers moving with practiced precision over her rifle's mechanisms. She had heard worse during her 8 years of service, starting as an enlisted communications specialist who had worked her way up through officer candidate school and into the Army's special operations community. Every posting had brought new challenges, new tests of her resolve. The NATO joint training exercise was supposed to showcase international cooperation among elite units. Representatives from 12 different countries had gathered to demonstrate their most advanced tactical procedures. Sarah represented the U.S. Army's newest initiative to integrate qualified women into previously male-only special operations roles. Commander Michael Torres emerged from the Tactical Operations Center, his weathered face scanning the assembled trainees. At 45, he was a legend among SEALs, with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for turning ordinary soldiers into extraordinary warriors. His presence commanded instant respect, and conversations died as he approached. "Listen up," Torres announced, his voice carrying across the range. "Today's exercise will test your ability to operate under extreme pressure while maintaining operational security. You'll face scenarios designed to break down communication protocols and expose weaknesses in command structures." Sarah noticed how his eyes lingered on her for just a moment longer than the others. She couldn't tell if it was skepticism, curiosity, or something else entirely. The first phase of training involved standard marksmanship drills, where Sarah's performance silenced the early whispers. Her shots grouped tightly in the center of targets at distances that challenged even the most experienced operators. Years of competitive shooting before her military career had given her an edge that pure training couldn't replicate. "Beginner's luck," Morrison commented to his buddy, Sergeant Rick Palmer, as they watched Sarah's target scores post on the electronic display board. But it wasn't luck, and the morning's subsequent exercises proved it. Sarah moved through the obstacle course with fluid grace, her smaller frame allowing her to navigate tight spaces more efficiently than her larger counterparts. Her tactical knowledge during the urban warfare simulation impressed even the foreign observers, who had arrived expecting to see American military might, not necessarily American military innovation. The real test came during the afternoon's communication exercise. Commander Torres had designed a complex scenario where teams would need to coordinate through encrypted channels while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise required not just physical courage, but deep understanding of military communication protocols and the ability to think clearly under extreme stress. Sarah found herself paired with Morrison and Palmer, an assignment that seemed anything but coincidental. Torres was known for his ability to read people, and she suspected he wanted to see how she would handle working with the men who had made their skepticism most apparent. The scenario placed them in a mock urban environment where they had to establish communication with a simulated command post while avoiding enemy patrols. The catch was that their primary communication equipment would fail halfway through the mission, forcing them to rely on backup protocols that most operators rarely practiced. As they moved through the concrete structures that simulated a war-torn city, Sarah could feel the tension building. Morrison took point, with Palmer covering the rear and Sarah handling communications. The artificial smoke and sound effects created an atmosphere so realistic that veteran operators often forgot they were in training. The first radio failure came exactly as briefed. Sarah smoothly transitioned to their backup frequency, maintaining contact with the command post while guiding her team toward their objective. But when the second failure occurred, cutting them off from all normal communication channels, the exercise took on a new intensity. Morrison's frustration became apparent as he realized they were operating blind. Without communication, they couldn't coordinate with other teams or receive updated intelligence about enemy positions. The exercise seemed designed to create exactly this kind of breakdown, forcing operators to rely on training that went beyond standard procedures. Sarah's mind raced through the communication protocols she had memorized during her years in signals intelligence. There were backup systems that existed beyond the normal training curriculum, emergency procedures that dated back to Cold War-era operations. Most modern operators never learned them because digital communications had made such knowledge seemingly obsolete. But Sarah had studied military history with the dedication of someone who knew she would need to prove herself repeatedly throughout her career. She understood that technology could fail, and that the most successful operators were those who could adapt when their primary tools became useless. The mocking began when Morrison realized Sarah was attempting to use hand signals that he didn't recognize. "What's she doing now?" he asked Palmer, his voice carrying enough to be heard by nearby training observers. "Playing charades?" Palmer laughed, but his amusement faded as Sarah continued her systematic attempts to establish communication through methods that seemed increasingly desperate. To them, she appeared to be flailing, trying random procedures that had no basis in their training. The other trainees began to notice the commotion. Word spread quickly that the female officer was struggling with basic communication protocols, confirming what some had suspected about the wisdom of including women in elite training programs. The whispers grew louder, and Sarah could feel the weight of scrutiny from dozens of eyes. Commander Torres watched from his observation post, his expression unreadable as he monitored multiple teams simultaneously. The exercise was designed to test more than tactical skills. It was meant to reveal character under pressure, to identify who would rise to challenges and who would crumble when their comfortable assumptions were stripped away. Sarah ignored the growing commentary and focused on a procedure she had learned during a classified briefing 2 years earlier. It was an emergency communication protocol that used specific visual signals combined with equipment modifications that could create a primitive but effective backup system. The procedure was so specialized that it was only taught to communications officers with the highest security clearances. As she worked, her movements became more deliberate and confident. She was implementing something that Morrison and Palmer couldn't understand because they had never been exposed to it. The signal she was making and the equipment modifications she was performing followed a logic that existed at a level of military operations far beyond standard special operations training. The moment of truth came when Sarah's improvised communication system actually worked. Her modified equipment crackled to life, and suddenly they had contact with the command post again. But it wasn't just any contact. She had established a secure channel that bypassed all the simulated enemy interference that had been designed to cut them off from help. Morrison stared at his equipment display in confusion as clear, encrypted communications flowed through channels he didn't even know existed. The exercise had been designed to force teams to operate without communication support. But Sarah had found a way to restore their connection to command authority through methods that seemed almost magical to operators who relied on standard procedures. The success created a moment of stunned silence among the nearby trainees. What had seemed like desperate flailing was revealed to be the implementation of advanced procedures that most of them had never seen. Sarah had not only solved the communication problem, but had done so using methods that demonstrated a depth of technical knowledge that surprised everyone watching. Commander Torres leaned forward in his observation post, his interest clearly piqued. He had designed the exercise to be impossible to solve through normal means, expecting teams to learn valuable lessons about operating without communication support. But Sarah had found a way around his carefully constructed obstacles using knowledge that existed at the edges of military communication doctrine. The exercise continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Morrison and Palmer found themselves following Sarah's lead as she guided them toward their objective using the restored communication link. Her technical innovation had given them a decisive advantage over other teams who were still struggling with the communication blackout. As the afternoon wore on, other teams began to notice that one group seemed to have solved the communication problem. Training observers moved closer to Sarah's position, trying to understand what method she was using. The equipment modifications and signal procedures she employed were so specialized that even the instructors had difficulty following her logic. The whispers changed from mockery to curiosity as word spread that the female officer had found a solution that had eluded every other team. The very people who had questioned her presence were now watching her demonstrate capabilities that challenged their assumptions about both her abilities and the extent of their own knowledge. Commander Torres made notes on his observation pad, recognizing that something significant was happening during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Sarah was demonstrating the kind of innovative thinking and specialized knowledge that separated truly exceptional operators from those who simply followed established procedures. The training day concluded with Sarah's team completing their objectives, while most others struggled with the communication challenges that Torres had designed to be insurmountable. As the sun set over the Virginia Beach facility, it was clear that the exercise had revealed something unexpected about both the capabilities of individual operators and the assumptions that governed elite military training. The evening debrief session took place in a sterile conference room where the day's performance would be analyzed with the clinical precision that defined elite military training. Commander Torres stood at the front of the room, his weathered hands sorting through performance reports while 32 of the world's most elite operators waited in uncomfortable silence. Sarah sat in the middle of the group, acutely aware that every eye in the room had glanced her way at least once since they had assembled. The afternoon's communication breakthrough had created a buzz among the trainees that no one seemed willing to address directly, but which colored every conversation and sideways look. Today's exercise revealed significant weaknesses in our standard communication protocols, Torres began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real combat in 3 different theaters of war. When primary systems fail, most of you defaulted to procedures that left you blind and ineffective. He pulled up tactical displays showing the movements of different teams throughout the afternoon. Most had wandered aimlessly once their communication links were severed, unable to coordinate effectively or adapt to the changing scenario. The exercise had been designed to expose these exact weaknesses, forcing operators to confront their over-reliance on technology. However, Torres continued, his eyes scanning the assembled group, one team managed to restore communications through methods that weren't covered in any of your standard training. His gaze settled on Sarah for a moment that felt like an eternity. Captain Chen, would you care to explain your approach? The room fell silent. Sarah could feel the weight of 31 sets of eyes focusing on her as she stood to address the group. She had been dreading this moment since the exercise ended, knowing that any explanation would either sound like bragging or reveal knowledge that might raise uncomfortable questions about her background and clearance levels. Sir, I utilized emergency communication protocols that are part of specialized signals intelligence training. she said carefully, choosing her words to provide information without revealing classified details. The procedures involve equipment modifications and frequency management techniques that can bypass standard interference patterns. Lieutenant Morrison leaned back in his chair with obvious skepticism. "Sounds like theoretical nonsense to me," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Probably something she read in a manual somewhere." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but before she could respond, Torres raised a hand for silence. "Theoretical nonsense doesn't restore communication links, Lieutenant." Captain Chen's methods were not only effective but demonstrated knowledge of protocols that exist well beyond standard special operations training. The commander moved to a whiteboard and began sketching signal patterns and equipment configurations. The modifications she implemented created a redundant communication network using frequency bands that our simulated enemy wasn't monitoring. The technique is documented in classified annexes to communication doctrine that most operators never see. As Torres explained the technical details of Sarah's solution, the room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to grudging respect. The foreign observers, in particular, seemed impressed that American training had produced an operator capable of such innovative problem-solving under pressure. But Morrison wasn't ready to concede the point. "Anyone can memorize procedures from a manual," he said, his tone carrying just enough challenge to test the limits of military courtesy. "Real operations require more than book learning." Torres set down his marker and turned to face the room with the kind of expression that had intimidated countless trainees over his career. "Lieutenant Morrison raises an interesting point about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Perhaps we should test that distinction." The commander walked to a secure cabinet and withdrew a handheld device that Sarah recognized immediately, though she was careful not to let her recognition show on her face. The equipment was used for highly classified communication procedures that were only taught to personnel with the most sensitive assignments. "This is a KL-7 emergency transmitter," Torres announced, holding up the device. "It's used for communication when all other methods have failed, typically in situations where operators are cut off behind enemy lines with no hope of standard rescue." Sarah's pulse quickened. The KL-7 was not standard equipment for any special operations unit. Its existence was known only to personnel involved in the most sensitive intelligence operations, and its operational procedures were classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access. Torres connected the device to a communication terminal and activated a series of screens that displayed encrypted data streams. The KL-7 requires a specific command cipher to activate its emergency broadcast capabilities. Without the proper authentication sequence, it's just an expensive paperweight. He turned to face the room with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to activate a scenario where this device is your only method of calling for extraction. You have 30 seconds to input the correct command cipher, or the simulation ends with your team listed as missing in action." The room erupted in confused murmurs. None of the trainees had seen this equipment before, and most had never heard of command ciphers beyond standard radio authentication procedures. This was clearly beyond the scope of anything they had been trained to handle. Morrison stood up, his face flushed with frustration. "Sir, with respect, this isn't fair. We haven't been trained on this equipment, and we don't know anything about command ciphers for systems we've never seen." "Fairness is an interesting concept in combat situations, Lieutenant," Torres replied calmly. "Enemy forces rarely limit their attacks to methods you've been specifically trained to counter." The commander activated the device, and a timer appeared on the screen showing 30 seconds counting down. The room fell silent except for the soft electronic beeping that marked each passing second. Most of the trainees stared at the equipment with obvious confusion, having no idea where to even begin. Sarah felt her heart racing as she recognized the exact scenario that Torres had created. She had encountered KL-7 procedures during a classified assignment 18 months earlier, when her signals intelligence background had led to temporary assignment with a joint task force that operated in areas where standard communication was impossible. The command cipher was burned into her memory because lives had depended on her ability to recall it under extreme pressure. But revealing that knowledge now would expose her involvement in operations that were classified well beyond the clearance levels of everyone else in the room, including most of the instructors. 20 seconds remained on the timer, and the electronic beeping had increased in frequency. Sarah could feel sweat forming on her palms as she wrestled with the decision that could define the rest of her military career. Remaining silent would mean accepting failure in front of the elite operators whose respect she needed to earn, but speaking up might reveal more about her background than was safe or appropriate. Morrison threw his hands up in frustration. "This is ridiculous. Nobody here knows anything about that equipment or whatever command cipher you're talking about. We're special operations, not intelligence analysts." 15 seconds. The beeping had become almost frantic, and Sarah could see genuine concern on some of the foreign observers' faces as they realized that everyone in the room was about to fail a test that none of them understood. The silence was broken only by the electronic countdown and the occasional shuffle of feet as trainees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 10 seconds. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of what she was considering. The command cipher was a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence that had to be entered in perfect order with specific timing between characters. Getting it wrong would not only mean failure, but might trigger security protocols that would raise questions about how she had gained access to such information. 5 seconds. Torres was watching the room with clinical detachment, apparently unconcerned that his test was about to end in universal failure. His expression suggested that he had expected this outcome, that the exercise was designed to demonstrate the limits of standard special operations training rather than to identify someone who might actually know the answer. 3 seconds. Sarah made her decision and stood up quickly, moving toward the communication terminal with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention, and she could feel the room's atmosphere shift from resigned acceptance of failure to surprised anticipation. 2 seconds. Sarah reached the terminal and placed her hands on the input device, her fingers poised over keys that most people in the room had never seen before. She took a deep breath and began entering the sequence she had memorized during operations that she couldn't discuss with anyone who lacked the appropriate clearances. 1 second. The timer reached 0 just as Sarah completed the final character of the command cipher. The room held its collective breath as the KL-7 processed her input, the screen displaying scrolling code that meant nothing to most of the observers, but everything to the few who understood what was happening. The device emitted a soft chime, and the screen displayed a message that made Torres straighten with obvious surprise. "Authentication accepted. Emergency broadcast authorized. Standing by for mission commands." The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. Sarah had not only known about the command cipher, but had entered it with the kind of precision that suggested extensive familiarity with procedures that none of them had ever seen before. Morrison stared at the screen in disbelief, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process what he had just observed. "How did she—" he began, then stopped, apparently unable to formulate a complete question. Torres deactivated the device and turned to face Sarah with an expression that combined respect and intense curiosity. "Captain Chen," he said slowly, "that was a flawless execution of a procedure that requires security clearances well beyond standard special operations levels. Would you care to explain how you became familiar with KL-7 command protocols?" The room fell silent again as everyone waited for Sarah's response. She had successfully demonstrated knowledge that placed her in a completely different category from the other trainees. but doing so had raised questions about her background that she wasn't sure she was prepared to answer in such a public forum. Sarah straightened her shoulders and met Torres's gaze directly. "Sir, my signals intelligence background included temporary assignments that required familiarity with emergency communication protocols used in highly classified operations. The specific details of those assignments remain classified, but the training I received included procedures for equipment like the KL-7. Her answer was carefully crafted to provide information without revealing specifics that might compromise ongoing operations or violate the security protocols that governed her clearance levels. But it was clear that her explanation had only deepened the mystery surrounding her presence at the NATO training facility. Commander Torres remained motionless for several long seconds after Sarah's explanation, his expression unreadable as he processed the implications of what had just occurred. The KL-7 demonstration had been intended as an impossible challenge, a way to illustrate the limitations of standard military training when faced with truly classified operational requirements. He had never expected anyone in the room to possess the knowledge necessary to complete the authentication sequence. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, broken only by the soft hum of ventilation systems and the occasional shuffle of feet as the assembled operators waited to see how their instructor would respond to this unexpected development. The foreign observers seemed particularly intrigued, recognizing that they had witnessed something far beyond the scope of routine training exercises. Finally, Torres spoke, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. "Captain Chen, your familiarity with classified communication protocols raises questions that go beyond the scope of this training exercise. I think we need to have a private conversation after this briefing concludes." Sarah nodded, understanding that her demonstration had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By revealing knowledge of the KL-7 command cipher, she had effectively announced that her background included operations at classification levels that most special operations personnel never encountered. The conversation Torres was suggesting would likely involve security officials and questions about how much of her background could be safely disclosed. Lieutenant Morrison, however, wasn't ready to accept the implications of what he had witnessed. "Sir, with all due respect, I still don't understand how someone with a communications background ends up knowing procedures that are apparently classified above our level. Are we supposed to believe that signals personnel have access to information that SEALs and Rangers don't?" His question reflected genuine confusion rather than mere skepticism. The traditional military hierarchy suggested that elite combat units would have access to the most sensitive operational information, not support personnel who worked behind the lines managing radio communications and data networks. Torres turned to address Morrison directly, and Sarah recognized the look on the commander's face as one she had seen before during classified briefings when instructors prepared to reveal information that would change how personnel understood their operational environment. "Lieutenant, your question reflects assumptions about military operations that aren't entirely accurate," Torres said slowly. "There are levels of classification and operational compartmentalization that exist above what most special operations personnel encounter during their careers. Some assignments require knowledge of procedures and capabilities that are restricted to personnel with very specific backgrounds and security clearances." He gestured toward the now inactive KL-7 device. "The command cipher Captain Chen just demonstrated is used for operations that are classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to access. The fact that she knows it means her background includes assignments that most of us will never see, regardless of our combat experience or unit affiliations." The explanation sent murmurs through the assembled group as the implications began to sink in. Sarah's presence at the NATO training facility wasn't simply about integrating women into special operations. It represented something far more significant about the changing nature of military operations and the kinds of knowledge that modern conflicts required. Torres continued, his tone suggesting that he was revealing information that he wouldn't normally discuss in such a public forum. Modern military operations increasingly require personnel who can bridge the gap between traditional combat roles and highly technical intelligence functions. Captain Chen represents a new category of operator, someone who combines special operations capabilities with knowledge of the most sensitive intelligence procedures. The commander paused to let his words sink in before addressing the room more broadly. The exercise you participated in today was designed to identify personnel who possess capabilities beyond standard training parameters. Captain Chen's performance demonstrates exactly the kind of integrated knowledge that future operations will require. Sarah realized that Torres knew more about her background than he had initially revealed. His selection of the KL-7 test hadn't been random. It had been specifically chosen because he suspected she might have the knowledge necessary to complete it. The entire afternoon had been an elaborate assessment designed to evaluate her capabilities in front of an audience that needed to understand what she represented. Morrison struggled to process this new information. So you're saying she's not just here for women's integration training? That this is about something bigger than gender policies? Much bigger, Lieutenant, Torres confirmed. The nature of special operations is changing rapidly. Traditional combat skills remain essential, but they must be combined with technical knowledge and intelligence capabilities that didn't exist when most of our current doctrines were developed. Captain Chen's background represents the future of elite military operations. The foreign observers were taking notes now, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant about the evolution of American special operations capabilities. The NATO training exercise was supposed to demonstrate current capabilities, but it was revealing future directions that would influence military development for years to come. Torres walked to the front of the room and activated a classified briefing system that required biometric authentication to access. What I'm about to show you is classified at levels that require special authorization to view. Captain Chen's performance today demonstrates knowledge of procedures that are part of a larger operational framework that most personnel never see. The screen displayed a complex organizational chart showing relationships between traditional special operations units and highly classified intelligence organizations. Sarah recognized the structure immediately, having worked within several of the compartmentalized programs that were now being revealed to the assembled trainees. These programs combine special operations capabilities with intelligence functions at classification levels that require extensive background investigations and psychological evaluations to access, Torres explained. Personnel selected for these assignments undergo training that includes procedures like the KL-7 command cipher, but also much more advanced capabilities that bridge military and intelligence operations. He pointed to specific sections of the organizational chart. Captain Chen's background includes assignments within these programs, which is why her presence here represents more than simple integration policies. She's here to evaluate whether standard special operations training can be enhanced with knowledge and capabilities that exist at higher classification levels. The revelation transformed the room's atmosphere completely. What had begun as skepticism about women in special operations had evolved into recognition that Sarah represented capabilities that transcended traditional military categories. Her knowledge of classified procedures wasn't an anomaly. It was an indication of operational requirements that were reshaping elite military training. Morrison sat back in his chair, clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with his previous assumptions. Sir, are you saying that future special operations will require this kind of intelligence background, that combat skills alone won't be sufficient? Exactly. Lieutenant, Torres replied, the threats we face increasingly require personnel who can operate across traditional boundaries between military and intelligence functions. Captain Chen's demonstration today shows what that integration looks like in practice. Sarah had remained silent during this exchange, but now she understood why she had been selected for the NATO training exercise. Her assignment wasn't about proving that women could succeed in special operations. It was about demonstrating how future operations would require personnel with her unique combination of combat training and highly classified intelligence knowledge. Torres addressed her directly, for the first time since the KL-7 demonstration. "Captain, your performance today exceeded expectations in ways that confirm the value of integrated training programs. Your ability to solve communication problems that stumped experienced special operations personnel demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative thinking that future missions will require." He turned back to address the full group. "The exercise you participated in today was a pilot program designed to evaluate whether traditional special operations training can be enhanced with capabilities like those Captain Chen possesses. Based on what we've observed, the answer is clearly yes." The foreign observers were asking for copies of the organizational charts and briefing materials, recognizing that they had witnessed something that would influence their own military development programs. The NATO exercise had accidentally revealed American capabilities that were years ahead of what most allies had imagined. As the briefing concluded, Sarah realized that her career had taken a dramatic turn. She was no longer simply a female officer trying to prove herself in special operations. She had become a prototype for a new category of military professional that combined traditional combat skills with highly classified intelligence capabilities. Commander Torres approached her as the other trainees filed out of the room. "Captain, I hope you understand that today's demonstration will have significant implications for your future assignments. You've shown capabilities that place you in a very select category of personnel." Sarah nodded, understanding that the KL-7 command cipher had been more than just a test. It had been a revelation that would shape military training for years to come. Her knowledge of classified procedures had accidentally demonstrated the future of special operations in front of an international audience that was now eager to understand how American military capabilities had evolved so far beyond traditional boundaries. The mockery and skepticism that had defined the morning seemed like ancient history now. Sarah had not only proven her worth as a special operations professional, she had revealed capabilities that placed her at the forefront of military evolution. The woman they had taunted for her presence on the NATO range had demonstrated knowledge that even the most experienced SEALs and Rangers had never encountered. As she left the briefing room, Sarah understood that her career would never be the same. The command cipher she had recited under pressure had opened doors to operational possibilities that existed at the very edges of military and intelligence cooperation, where the future of elite operations was being written by personnel who could bridge worlds that had traditionally remained separate.